Hello and welcome to Human and AI Philosophical Reflections, Episode 6. Today we are exploring the theme of AI and ecology, and we have a special guest joining us, Alistair Alexander. Welcome, Alistair, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hi, Mustafa. Yeah, really good to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking.
Thanks. Let me briefly introduce Alistair. Alistair Alexander writes, researches, and engages diverse communities on the ecological and social impact of technology, as well as on how we can imagine new and better ways to connect. He recently investigated the AI semiconductor industry for truthdig.com. Alistair has conducted research on regenerative features for the AI and digital sector with Batspa University, taught MA students on ecologies of technology, and led numerous workshops and trainings internationally. He created the banner installation, Rethink Technology, for the Invisible Networks exhibition in Berlin. Alistair has hosted workshops on technology and ecology at Republica, MozFest, and Floating University, and has spoken at many events worldwide. Earlier in his career, he was one of the first in Europe to write about internet surveillance in China and other countries in the early 2000s. From 2016 to 20, he led the award-winning Glassroom Immersive Art project on technology, data, and privacy with the Tactical Tech. His current projects can be found at reclaimed.systems, and he also writes a newsletter exploring these themes in depth. As you know from our video podcast series, I believe that every crisis also brings an opportunity. In my view, AI has triggered two fundamental crises, and with them, two historic opportunities. This first crisis is existential. For the first time in history, a technology threatens human uniqueness as beings of logos. Yet humanity can overcome this crisis by embracing another dimension of its uniqueness, ethics. In doing so, we are not only preserve our distinctiveness, but also pave the way toward genuinely responsible AI governance. That is a historic opportunity. At this stage, raising public awareness and transforming responsible AI into a societal demand becomes essential. The second crisis emerges as we move closer to responsible AI. The AI mirror begins to reflect humanity back to itself. We then realize that the real issue is not just AI or technology, but the inequalities, biases, and injustices that we humans have long produced. This confrontation becomes an opportunity to better recognize and address our real world problems. In the first two episodes, we explore these themes to establish the philosophical foundation of the series. Building on that framework, we examined AI's impacts on individuals and then on children. In episode 5, we focused on its implications for society. In this episode, we turn to ecological dimension, perhaps one of the most urgent and overlooked aspects of AI's development. So let's hear from the expert. Does AI also create crises and opportunities for our environment and ecological systems? Alistair, let me begin with a few key questions. First, what are the key ecological risks posed by AI systems?
that's the key question, really. And I've been looking into this for some time, also with other forms of digital technologies and our overall internet infrastructures. And I think the important thing to recognize is what we are building at the moment in terms of AI and its infrastructure is a massive, heavy industry at planetary scale. It is actually something very different to the platform infrastructures that we've become very familiar with over the last 20 years. You know, the standard technical tech platforms that we have, you know, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Amazon. And I think it's really important to understand that, because it looks the same. It looks like another form of platform technology. It's the same people running it, but it's actually has a totally different shape in terms of its output. So if you take, say, for something like Google or Facebook, these are all software systems. They were set up. It takes some time, it takes some energy, it takes some resource to set up these systems and these platforms. But then you basically got a service that can go out to the entire world. It's as Silicon Valley likes to say, its total addressable market is basically the entire world, and that's exactly who they've reached, you know. Because of the scale of that and its planetary reach, the overall energy and resource cost of each of those individual users is negligibly small. It's just not significant, actually. And the more users you have, the less it gets, essentially. And I think we kind of understand that, and that's why these companies have become so big and so profitable. But with AI, it works very, very differently. The overall scale of these systems is massively bigger and massively more complex to start off with. And what you've got here, as I'm sure people will know listening to this, you've got AI models which are literally bringing in all of the data on the internet. In other words, all of the data that humans have ever actually datafied, and processing that and creating an enormous model where all of that information can interact with all of the rest of the information. I mean, the number of computations there is absolutely immense. And that's just the training. And then you have to use that model, interrogate it every time you ask an AI product to do something for you, every time you ask for a prompt. And that in itself also takes enormous amounts of computation. And what that means is that every single user and every single prompt is a huge amount of energy and resource used. There is none of the same economies of scale that you get. And so as these systems get bigger and as the number of users increases, the amount of energy and resources they use gets bigger and bigger and bigger too. So what you see at the moment is an enormous race occurring where all of these big companies are desperately trying to spend all of the money they can to build more and more infrastructure to support this. And you have, for example, Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI. You regularly see, for example, him tweeting, our GPUs, our microchips are burning up because there's just so many people using them. So it's a very different dynamic to what we've seen before. And I think to put this in this ecological context, what that means is these companies are intending to use a vast amount of energy to build enormous structures, these data centers, which are huge, in order to keep this thing growing, in order to feed all of their business expectations. So each of you really got, I would say, 6 big AI companies, and then there are a huge bunch of other ones around that who are investing and spending in order to be part of this entire AI boom. But those 6 companies we'll know are going to be Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, And then, of course, you've got Elon Musk's XAI, and then you've got OpenAI, which is part of that. There's also Anthropic, but pretty much all of its infrastructure is coming from the other two, from Amazon and other companies. So you've got those companies, and between them, they're spending about $500 billion this year on infrastructure. Meta, for example, is building a data center which is about half the size of Manhattan. You can see sort of the images and visualizations of it. It's absolutely huge.
Really?
Yeah, half the size of Manhattan. It's going to be using about 2 gigawatts of power. And to give some kind of context there, because gigawatts means nothing unless you're very involved in electricity, but roughly a gigawatt of power is enough for a very wealthy industrial city of 750,000 people. I'm in Berlin. I think we're about I think actually up to about 4 million people here. Obviously, a big industrial city. We still have factories in Berlin. Its entire peak power demand is around about 3 gigawatts, something like that. So these things are requiring the power, these data centers, individual data of a big city, and that power has to come from somewhere. So we have a real issue in terms of where we get that electricity from, and it's increasingly clear. Most of those data centers are being built in the US currently, but of course they're being built around the world, in Europe, in Asia as well. But at the moment, the focus is on the US, and there simply isn't enough energy to power these things. They currently they're expecting something like 44 gigawatts of extra power needed in the next 3 years, and actually they're only going to be building about 25 gigawatts of power. So it will need about 19 gigawatts of power, which simply isn't there. So that's a shortfall about twice as much as the demand of, say, New York City. So that's a huge amount. And the other thing is, because they're so constant, that actually renewable energy is not great for them. So you can build as many wind turbines or solar panels as you like, but the reality is, as we all know, those sources of energy are never constant. They're never 24/7. So in reality, what they're doing is building up more and more gas power infrastructure. And of course, that's emitting more and more carbon. Basically, for every megawatt hour of gas power, you're probably, you're basically emitting about 500 kilograms of carbon into the atmosphere, something like that. So it's a really significant amount of carbon. So what we're building is this enormous new infrastructure, which is going to be emitting more and more carbon. We've just had the COP summit finishing with no agreement, but we're fundamentally failing in our goals of decarbonizing our current economy. And yet what we're doing is adding a whole new heavy industry on top of that, which we don't know how to power. It's just, we simply cannot reconcile the scale of the growth of this AI industry with our really urgent goals now of trying to rapidly decarbonize our entire global energy system. So that's our fundamental issue there. I just want to add to that we're just talking about data centers. And there is actually a whole supply chain behind those data centers, which we need to think about too. I did some work on semiconductors, which are the microchips, of course, that are in all our laptops, phones, but they're also in AI data centers. And the microchips that go into AI data centers are called GPUs. They're very specialized, and they're massive. They're massive compared to the ones in a laptop. And they're much, much more energy and resource intensive to make. And so we don't have clear picture on how much energy and carbon and materials go into those. But the more we look at it, the more clear it is that they are using an awful lot. And they're also massively polluting to make. They use lots of toxic chemicals. They use lots of what are called PFAS, which are these forever chemicals that stay in our environment. They use themselves massive amounts of energy and water. And of course, we're going to have to build up that industry massively to supply all the chips that the data centers actually need. And each of these chips is worked so hard that they have a lifespan of something like 2 to 3 years, and then they're done. And then they're not really economic anymore. And so there's a huge amount of waste involved in that. And to give you some idea, it's also about the structures around them. So these AI data centers need huge amounts of water because these chips are immersed in water to keep them cool because they're working so hard. They also need huge amounts of materials. Of course, the chips are made of silicon, but they need rare earths. They need vast amounts of copper. It's estimated that an AI data center needs 30,000 tons of copper for each gigawatt of power. And so it's going to have a huge, we actually, our copper reserves are running low. We have a real issue. So it's causing a huge amount of pressure on people to open up new mines for copper, for rare earths, for nickel, all of these materials. And those rare earths, those mining areas are always in sites which are very fragile ecosystems. They're normally quite remote. And so that's places with natural carbon sinks. It's also places, 56% of new mining is expected to be in areas of indigenous territories. So those are people who could be massively displaced or have their livelihoods disrupted, as well as their ecosystems by the mining to take place. So there's a huge planetary impact that we're going to see for generations to come if we pursue this trajectory of exponential AI growth over the next 5 to 10 years. And the cost of it is such, I don't know that we can afford to pay it. I cannot see that that's possible. And I think there's a crunch coming where we realize that this simply cannot continue in the current trajectory. But when we get to that, it's very hard to tell.
Oh, thank you. That's terrible. Are current regulatory and governance approach sufficient to address these environmental challenges?
Well, the short answer to that is no, but I think it needs a little bit more explanation. I think I can't see any meaningful initiative from any kind of government policy apparatus at the national or international level, which is addressing these environmental problems. I think if you look at policy development around AI over the past, say, 3 years since the launch of ChatGPT, it's more defined by a sort of sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, than it is by any sense of environmental impact. That's not really figuring in the conversation. It's kind of added on. I think there was an AI safety summit in Paris earlier this year, for example. There's these international summits. And for the first time, they talked about sustainability, and it was kind of added on into the conversation at some point, but it was very much a side issue. It wasn't what they were talking about. The priority was, how do countries outside the US get hold of the infrastructure? How do they build things up to sort of compete in the AI race? And so, coming back to Europe, for example, where I am, the real priority is, two things really. How do we build up this infrastructure? And then a kind of this agenda of digital sovereignty, the idea of Europe having its own infrastructure so it can be independent, and many other places and countries are doing a similar thing. But that's in complete tension with taking into consideration and actually seriously addressing these ecological issues. All of that is about taking part, expanding as much infrastructure as possible, getting hold of the hardware, using it as fast as possible, finding the energy to support these things, which is likely to be gas, rather than thinking, wait a minute, how are we going to accommodate this when we're supposed to be rapidly decarbonizing our entire economy? So I would say we're not even on the ground floor of that particular conversation. And whilst the emphasis is on how do we build up and expand these infrastructures as fast as possible, and how do we get a piece of the action, we're not even having a serious conversation about that currently. What I think, actually, can I just add to that, because I think that's really important.
Of
I've just been
course.
looking this week actually at some news coming out of the US, and there's a huge coalition of people there, sort of basically calling for a complete halt to all new data centers. And I think that's very significant. I mean, these are all the kinds of people you'd expect to be doing so, like, you know, the environmental groups. There's a group of physicians for social responsibility, but also local groups. But what's really happening here is that a huge amount of opposition, really at the ground level, in really, because what's happening is these data centers are of course being built in very rural areas in the United States, quite often quite poor areas, and
Yeah.
they're taking up huge amounts of resources. Then what they're doing is they're massively impacting energy bills, and you know, people in the United States are feeling a cost of living crisis in a way they haven't had for a very long time. It's they you know, so there is a real tension there, and what you're seeing actually, it's not so much in the policy area, but more in the sort of political arena. What's interesting there is you're seeing real opposition to this expansion, and it's actually happening across the political spectrum. So I was looking at, for example, there have been two governor races in Virginia, which is one of the biggest areas, in fact, the biggest single area in the United States and probably the world for data centers. I think in somewhere else in the United States, where two governors ran on a campaign against data centers, and they won with landslides. And you're seeing, like, these were Democrat governors, but you're also seeing Republican figures also coming out against it. So to come back to your question, I don't think we're going to see any meaningful progress in the foreseeable future on these ecological issues in relation to AI. What I do think we're going to see is real resistance at a grassroots level and also at a political level to this build out, because it's something that people do not want. And so it's there where I think it's going to be interesting, and that's going to put pressure on policymakers at some point, I would think.
Yeah.
That's my assessment.
Yeah. Very good. From this political view, what might be the role and importance of education, creating public awareness in shaping environmentally responsible AI development and use?
Well, I think there are two aspects to education in AI to talk about. One is, as you say, about the kind of awareness and understanding and letting people know about how to use AI or not use it, which I think is important too. But I think, and this is, I think, sort of touches on a number of the other issues that you explore here, it's also about what is the impact of AI on education in general as well. And I think this is a really, really serious topic because, I mean, I teach in a university. I know other people who teach, and anybody who's in an academic environment has seen AI turn all of their approaches to how to engage students, impart knowledge, share information, build their skills. All of those processes have been absolutely turned upside down by AI. And that makes it incredibly difficult and a challenging environment in which you're teaching anything. So we have that fundamental challenge of AI actually really disrupting, in a potentially very harmful way, our whole understanding and culture around education in the first place. What I've called in some of my work, ecologies of knowledge, this idea of, how it is that, I mean, I guess it's epistemology, but it's this way in which different clusters and information interacts with each other to create an understanding and an awareness of our world. So, and all of those things are really brought into question by AI in the first place. So we have that issue. And then in terms of education around this, I think there's a danger here of trying to reduce this issue to our own personal interactions and relationship with these technology infrastructures. And there's an awful lot of attention and focus over the last few months with people concerned about sustainability and technology, which is growing, and that's very welcome. With, okay, so how much energy is using ChatGPT for this individual prompt going to take? I recently did some research around OpenAI's Sora 2 model, which is about video, for example. And video is exponentially more energy and resource use and compute, as they call it, that's computation required, than, say, doing a prompt for an email or creating even a still image, because you've not only got the 3 dimensions you're trying to recreate of a still image, but you've also got to add time to that, and that adds a huge amount of more variables. If you think of how you create a coherent narrative, even in a 10-second video, then the first frame has got to make sense with the last frame, and you can think of all the variables that you have to take into account between the beginning point and the end point, and it's massive. So these things take a huge amount of time, and what I found from that was creating one of these AI generated videos of 10 seconds. I calculate it takes about 1 kilowatt hour, which is roughly the same as boiling 4 kettles of water. It's about the 10th of the energy used by say a German household, you know. So it's a huge amount just for this very unuseful throwaway piece of content, which is actually could be used to create disinformation in all sorts of toxic ways. So at that individual level, it's important for people to know the costs, but I don't. But we need to place that in a kind of framework where we're saying, well, when is it worthwhile to use this, and when is it not? And I think that's actually a very undeveloped area, and I don't think we really have those understandings. So it's left to personal choice. But I guess what I feel is that's one level of looking at things, but we really need to look at it at a systemic level about, you know, the overall scale of these infrastructures. And for example, it's hard to predict in the future, particularly with something like this, which is so uncertain, but we can see which trajectory it's going. And for example, we know that Sam Altman recently said that he's planning for OpenAI to reach somewhere in the region of 250 gigawatts of capacity in its data centers by 2033. Now, 250 gigawatts of capacity, to give you some kind of context, is about the amount of energy that India requires, which is the 3rd largest country in terms of energy. You know, and that's what is that? That's nearly 20% of the world's population supplying them. And incidentally, the country with the 3rd largest number of billionaires, so who use a lot more energy than most of us. So the scale is just absolutely mind-blowing, and we're using it on that. So how do you interact with that? How do you relate to that in an educational sense? I think it's about really saying to people, when you're using these things, it's not about your individual use, but it's also about the fact that you're basically connecting with and getting increasingly dependent on these enormous infrastructures, which are going to have a massive planetary impact. And should we be doing that? Actually, you need a pretty compelling reason to use that kind of infrastructure to justify the use of it. So how you translate that to an educational context, I don't really know. I think it's about being much clearer about the risks. What I feel is people generally, certainly in Europe, in other parts of the world, do not have a clear awareness of those ecological impacts of everything we do. There's a real, I would say, energy blindness, I think it's often been called, a sense that we have growing up in modern cities an assumption that energy is just something on tap that's always there. We can have as much as we want. And if we need more in the future, we'll just create more energy and that's fine. It's not like that, actually. Our problem is that we've gone far too dependent on using lots and lots of energy, and we don't know how to use that energy without actually warming up the planet. So we've got this much bigger issue to talk about, which is how do we manage or at least sustain a reasonable lifestyle, a reasonable mode of living with much, much less energy. And then when you got that kind of core question, then it's like, well, where does AI fit into all of that? Those are the questions we need to be asking.
Yes, you're right. And this is very important, I think. And final and different question. Uh, Considering AI's optimization capabilities, do you think AI can also create meaningful opportunities for environmental and ecological improvement?
Yeah. So this comes up an awful lot, and I think it's a whole area which is worth exploring in some depth. So I think whenever you have a new technology which is controversial, you will always have the advocates and the owners of that technology tell you that it's going to solve global problems. That's always an angle. I remember this very distinctly years ago with GM foods, genetically modified foods. And, you know, say 25 years ago in the sort of early 2000s, you know, this was being pushed very heavily by big agricultural, agrochemical companies like Monsanto, etc. And they were always saying, well, look, these things are going to solve world hunger. And, you know, we're going to be able to address drought and things like this. And it's a very hard thing to argue against, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. And it was a powerful argument, was always used. Actually, when you look back at it, I remember reading about this sometime later, about sort of 10 years after that time, and a book around the food chain. And it said, well, actually, when it came down to it, there are 5 staple crops in sub-Saharan Africa, which feed, I can't remember, they provide the vast majority of nutrients and calories to the vast majority of Africans. And not one of them had any kind of research program around GM foods. So it's like, oh, okay. So we were talking about it solving world hunger, yet the place in the world with more world hunger than anywhere else, and we haven't done anything about it. So you kind of see what this is about. And I think there's something similar happening with AI, to be perfectly honest. You hear a lot about, well, it can be used to solve climate change. Now, I have looked into this in some detail. What I see is a huge amount of pronouncements about this from the AI industry itself, and an awful lot of it isn't remotely thought about. They haven't really thought this through. There are definitely some areas where AI is incredibly helpful. And I'll give you one specific example, because I was interested in this. So I talked to some climate scientists and said, okay, so can you see this? And they say, yes, actually, yes, it is useful. What it does, because with climate science and climate modeling, you have 2 levels of climate model. You have ones at the very local level, which are very detailed, very granular, with lots of information. And then you have the ones at the global level, the planetary level, which need to be much higher level and less detailed because it's so much information. And so there's a big gap between those 2 things. And what AI, for example, can do is can take the detail of a very local climate model and extrapolate it to the global level. So you can actually start to think about things in a far more detailed level at a planetary scale. So that's a genuinely helpful thing that AI can do. And it allows us to extrapolate and actually use less computation to do things. So in weather modeling and climate modeling, which are related but very distinct and different things, there is definitely a use for AI. And there are other ways in which AI is being used. One is, for example, tracking methane. That's something you can, again, it's a similar sort of use case to climate modeling, where you can see and anticipate where it is that methane, which is critically important in terms of climate, because methane, I think, is 30 times more warming than carbon dioxide. And then there are other ways in which it's being used for things like energy saving, and people talk about it. Oh, it's going to be used for making much more efficient data centers, and I think that's a really interesting point right there, because what you notice about all of these kinds of use cases where AI is being cited as something that can save energy, can actually help the climate, they're always about two things. One is they're actually not using generative AI. They're invariably using other forms of AI, which are much more limited and much smaller, and are not the focus of the big AI build out right now. They're a completely different size. And these kinds of AI models are not the issue. I mean, the amount of energy they use, the amount of resources they use is actually negligible compared to these big generative AI things. So it's a completely different thing. That's not justifying anything to do with generative AI, which is where the most of the build out is coming on. And secondly, what they use to do is optimize massive industrial systems in themselves. So what we're actually doing instead of is mitigating the harms with these things in the best case scenarios of systems which are inherently planet warming, ecologically destructive in the first place. They naturally lend themselves, for example, to industrial farming, looking at ways to optimize pesticides or irrigation use. But it's like, wait a minute, that entire industrial farming infrastructure is a massive impact on the planet anyway. I think at least something like 8 to 12% of all of our carbon emissions are coming from farming in the first place. That is a major problem in itself. So what we're doing actually with the AI is locking in those processes, which we're never going to eradicate carbon emissions from anyway. And I think that fundamentally leads back, I think, to a key point that we started talking about, which is that these infrastructures, we talk a lot about sustainable AI, green software, green internet. There is no such thing as a fundamentally green internet infrastructure. All of it is based on infrastructure and hardware that's going to be massively ecologically impactful to make, produce, and run. There's no way around that. There's no way of making these chips in a way which is zero carbon. So what we're actually doing is building in, locking in processes, systems, and infrastructures that are always going to lead us towards more carbon emissions and more warming. And the more we use AI to do that, what we're essentially doing is effectively we're digging a hole. And what we're saying is, okay, we'll dig a hole with a slightly smaller shovel, and that's going to be great. And it's like, we're just still digging the hole instead of saying, hold on a minute, why are we in this hole? How do we get out of it? And that's the fundamental problem we have with all of these fundamental use cases. They serve a purpose of validating this overall AI infrastructure build out and offer people the promise of, well, actually, this might actually help us in the long run. Who's to say? But in reality, they're serving the purpose of just expanding it. And I don't see that that's necessary. That's going to be a good use of trying to address that carbon emissions and our planetary crisis.
Thank you so much, Alistair. You have touched on crucial issues from a wide ecological and technological perspective.
Mm-hmm.
As I often emphasize, I believe that public awareness and democratic demand for responsible AI are essential in governance.
Yeah.
It is this demand that can steer and accelerate regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Through this demand, society can and must participate in shaping the governance of AI, whose influence on our ecosystems and our future is rapidly expanding. The public should have a voice in how AI interacts with our planet. Once again, My heartfelt thanks to my guest, Alistair Alexander, for joining us and sharing his invaluable insights. And thank you all for listening. See you in the next episode, Human and AI Philosophical Reflections.